California office where I did their CJ portfolio and worked on sentencing reforms, worked on the marijuana legalization ballot initiative. We organized, dozens and dozens of expungement clinics to clear criminal convictions, especially around drug cases. So we did a lot, and I have I have never been directly impacted by incarceration, but I have a lot of loved ones that have been incarcerated because of the war on drugs, whose life have been ruined because of weed laws. So many things, but I really appreciate being on this conversation with Laura, Jeanette, Maritza, some amazing femmes in this labor and the work.
Thanks, Dionysus. Also, shout out to Juan Cartagena, who I see has joined us and gave us a shout out in the chat. We are Juan fans over here. Juan, welcome to the conversation. And welcome to others who just joined. We're just getting started with some introductions. And last but not least, Laura, do you want to introduce yourself for the audience, please?
Yes, hello everybody. I'm very, very excited and privileged to be here with Jeanette, Eunices, and Maritza. I'm Laura Guzman. I'm kind of a veteran of the harm reduction movement. I started doing harm reduction work and organizing in 1995, about 2 years after the movement was born, and had the privilege to be taught by the pioneers of the movement and people who use drugs themselves. I've been in my career primarily supporting and organizing with immigrants who have been impacted by houselessness and drug use, and so have about 25 years of experience serving the community, but also organizing on those issues that are so dire, so dire still and so dear to us, like, making sure that there is housing, making sure that we are gonna end up with, an immigration reform that is really gonna, tender and nurture our communities and our youth. How did I came to the Harm Reduction Coalition? The National Harm Reduction Coalition seeks to create spaces and dialogue to what we call heal the racialized drug policies. We believe that all drug policies have been racialized in this country, and it's more than 50 years. And we also seek to build power and equity with people who use drugs themselves. What I do as the California Senior Director of Capacity Building and Community Mobilization is to really activate all of the aspects of similarly Drug Policy Alliance, where we do capacity building, training, technical assistance, community mobilization and organizing, and also grant making, which is one of the new initiatives we have in California. And I guess I'm gonna leave it like that. And my history in policy, I'm actually a Juris Doctor who never practiced law, thank God, but I had the privilege to really have been in many, many movements, the immigration rights movement, primarily in San Francisco and the Bay Area, but also the housing movement, and in brutality cases where I participated actively after the killing of several Latinx in San Francisco.
Thank you, Laura. And then you brought up something important that leads right into our first question, actually, and that's the racialized war on drugs. So I did want to start with sort of, a level setting, high level type of question to just, break that down for folks. If this is your first foray into the war on drugs, we do want to, break that down for you and explain what exactly we mean when we're talking about that. So I'll turn to Jeanette for this first question. If you could explain to our audience what we mean when we say the war on drugs, what's the history of the war on drugs, and can you explain why it's been a racialized war, as Laura pointed out?
Yeah, well, when we talk about the war on drugs, most folks think about 1970s and Richard Nixon and his administration really just changing the whole dynamics of which communities they're going to be focusing on. And so it was really, an internal decision that we later found out was actually evident in the focus on really just, African Americans, on Latinos, and on poor folks. It was really just a war during the 70s that really focused from the Nixon administration on these major groups in the U.S. But when you look at the history and the roots of the actual drug war, we have to go back to the 1870s, and it's so relevant today when I think about this, because the first anti-drug law that passed in the U.S. actually passed in around the 1870s. It was around opium, and it was around Chinese immigrants on the West Coast. And so, when you connect the dots and you start looking at sort of the precept, sort of the inception of the war on drugs, and where we're at today. It's this long trajectory, and it's so closely aligned with our immigration system, with our immigration history, right? Because we also had like the first opium laws passed in the 1870s. We had the Chinese Exclusion Acts passed around the same time. There is also alignment with anti-poverty laws that started around this time. There's just so many systems that have been impacted by the very foundation of the drug war. And then we kind of move into the 1900s, where we saw the first actual, Narcotics Act. 1930s really looked at criminalizing marijuana, and also based in the West Coast, really spearheaded by by Hearst and the Hearst family, because there was just this big on the ground war between Hearst and his concerns about the Mexicanization of California. So we see those racist underpinnings again, and then we go, into the 70s, where where the federal government just created, the drug schedules here that placed a lot of substances that folks had been using for medicinal purposes. We finally get that drug schedule. And then in the 80s, we get this pretty comprehensive Crime Control Act that, again, established longer sentences, increased bail amounts for drug offenders and the like. And then we also get, the huge sentence enhancements in the 90s for crack cocaine. And that specifically targeted our Black and Brown communities with no recourse, right? And so, not to belabor this, but there's also, again, alignment with the immigration system. We saw in the 90s some of the most draconian immigration laws that passed in this country, and we're still reeling the effects of those laws and that alignment today. And so this history is rich, it's vast, it intersects so many different movements. And I think, obviously, the more that we can connect the dots for folks, the more that we can make the argument on how this whole drug war has evolved, the more we need to sort of dismantle it and end it once and for all.
Thank you, Jeanette. Yeah, when I think of the racialized drug war, the example that always sticks out in my head is around marijuana. Before marijuana became a term that was coined by the federal government, it was often referred to by its name, its plant name, its scientific name, cannabis. But, the US federal government made an intentional choice to call it marijuana and actually write that word in the federal code to make it sound foreign, to associate it with Mexican immigrants and, Mexicans who lived in the US. And that was a really intentional choice, essentially to, have a reason to dispose of that community and, create, negative stereotypes about a community. And all of this plays out today because, we have drug policy that has literally been born out of racism, and it's been carried on the backs of people of color. And we see those effects today. And, this history is important, but this is still happening. In fact, simple drug possession continues to be a huge feeder into the criminal justice system. Marijuana possession itself, even though all these states are legalizing marijuana, every minute someone's arrested for marijuana possession. And we know for our non-citizen brothers and sisters that this carries immense implications in the immigration system. So I do want to turn to Ioannis to talk about, how you see the drug war impacting individuals in your community today and in your work.
Thank you for that question, Maritza. So like growing up, I grew up in this northeast part of the city of LA. And, it was a place where it was an intersection of different neighborhood gangs and cliques. And now it's completely gentrified and different. So the responses are different, right? But growing up, like me and my friends, we'd go out, we'd go up and park in like the cul-de-sacs, and for the most part, we'd consume marijuana and it was okay. But, in another panel that we were on, the issue around financial literacy came up. And it was like, well, if you teach our kids and invest in financial literacy, it would get rid of a lot of these things. But, this idea of like being able to pull yourself up from your bootstraps, like some of us didn't even have bootstraps to pull ourselves up from. So, and I say this because, a lot of my friends had to turn to different types of of ways to earn income. Some of them sold weed, marijuana. You know, some of them got caught, some of them didn't. One of my friends in 2011 got caught selling concentrate, and his life was destroyed from that moment. He got a conviction in California. There are over 4,800 collateral consequences that look like policies that prevent people from obtaining housing, general relief, and other supportive services once they have a conviction. So he wasn't able to get a job. He wasn't able to get housing. He couldn't expunge it because he didn't have money. You have to pay to be on probation. He couldn't pay to be on probation, so there was a warrant put out on his arrest. And all of this because he was selling weed to make an income to survive. Yet, the aftershock of that has completely ruined his life. And the last time that we were able to connect was in 2017 when we were taking him to court to get his marijuana conviction, reduced from a felony down to a misdemeanor. And so even I'll just take a step back and say that was great, but in California, even a misdemeanor can prevent you from getting access to housing and jobs that could help you, overcome some of these barriers that come up out of this. So, I have a friend right now who's struggling with the use of meth, who's houseless. And I'm connected to county department heads, right, that offer these services. But the thing is, we've invested so much money in incarcerating and criminalizing people and relying on the jails for access to services around, substance use services, that we haven't invested in community. And so there's not places for my friend to go to. There's the programs that exist around diversion, for the most part, for many drug users, are like these carrot and the stick models where, you got to be sober instead of the harm reduction models that I'm sure that Laura pushes for, but that's the alternatives to incarceration piece. And I know I'm getting into somewhere else, but this is what I've seen in my community, where there's been over-criminalization, not a lack of, and a complete lack of access to resources. And we even also see it in the jails, because for example, in LA County, the top 5 charges that bring women into the LA County jail system are, the top one is possession of a controlled substance, and the rest 4 of them are related to poverty, mental health, and substance use. Driving with a suspended license, a DUI. Most 40% of the women in the jail are Latinas. But also, to take a step back, Black women in our communities are only 8% of the general population, but nearly 35% of the people inside of our county jails. Mm-hmm. And they were also the group that was least released during COVID-19 releases that were happening in LA County. So the same systems that are harming us, but that are disproportionately harming our Black community members at higher numbers, we have to understand that those are the same systems that are filtering our people at higher numbers, our communities at higher numbers. That doesn't mean that there's a dichotomy of, one community over another, but it's like, we have to understand that in order for us not to be filtered in, that we have to dismantle these systems for all our communities. But that I'll pass it back to you, Maritza, and I hope that was good.
That was great. As always, Leonisis. Thank you. But Laura, I did want to pivot to you because, I think some of us might be familiar with the punitive approaches. Even if this is the first time really talking about drug policy, we all know that people are arrested and convicted all the time for drug possession and drug activity. But there is another way, and that other way is a harm reduction public health approach. Will you break that down for folks and explain what do we mean when we talk about harm reduction in the drug policy context? And if that could, I hope that leads into a conversation about the work that you do on the ground.
I just want to say, though, that Eunice just broke it down in some ways, exactly all the things that we need to do different, and that I just want to name it for the Latinx community. There's so many public health approaches that we have done nothing about that needs to be built. So I just want to acknowledge that Eunice has just built the landscape. So I want to emphasize 2 things. Harm reduction, I want to start again to say, it's a social justice movement that actually came about in the mid-1990s as a result of 10 years of government and public health abandonment of people who used drugs and were dying of AIDS. So I think it's very important to know that the movement came actually straight from community and advocates. It was not sanctioned by government, was not public health coming and saying, what do we do? It was actually drug users and activists realizing if we actually exchange syringes and people don't share syringes, then that might be the way that they die at much lesser rate. And in just context for all the youth that are joining us today, in 1990, 50% of all deaths in New York City were related to drug injections. So people were dying without any interventions. So that is why for us, elevating, I think same as the Drug Policy Alliance, elevating the voice of drug users in any public health approach and community approaches, as well as the dignity of and the right of people who use drugs is very important to us. Now, in terms of practical applications, we define it as, you know, a set of strategies and ideas that, again, need to be informed by people who use drugs themselves that can really minimize the impacts of drug use, the impacts of drug use, but also the impacts of all the systems that we've been talking about. In that sense, I also want to say that we really like to focus, as Eunice was talking about, in the people most impacted, because there is a whole set of drug users in this world, which is probably the majority of us in this room. But we really want to highlight in the harm reduction movement that our ability to actually reduce harms is much more impacted by poverty, by class, definitely by race. You know, people involved in the sex work industry, folks who are also impacted by low-level drug sales, you know, the hustling that it takes to survive. And so to us, it's very important that we highlight in harm reduction interventions that direct, so whatever we're doing has to directly impact. And that's why policies matter, right? And, you know, I'm one of the ones that sometimes I'm actually challenging reform. And I know that this whole forum is about reform, because in reform, we kind of keep churning the wheel of in some ways, re-stigmatizing, re-traumatizing. And, you know, marijuana is a good example, but there are so many others. I'm going to give you an example of what we're doing with overdoses. One of our so we really want to scale up and call public health and government to scale up particular issues like ending all overdoses, making sure that every state in the United States has syringe service programs so people get clean needles. I mean, still today, 25, 30 years later, clean needles and get actually naloxone distribution. And we also are really pushing for community-based interventions around overdose. And having said that, I also have to say, we firmly believe that unless we work in all the other intersections Jeanette was mentioning, so unless we're really working in decriminalization, housing, making sure that we will have drug treatment in Spanish, drug treatment that really doesn't make people to feel ashamed about, drug treatment that is culturally competent, and also all these diversion strategies that, you know, as Eunice has mentioned, really help people rather than not. And one good example is in San Francisco, you might go to a drug court, you're an undocumented Nicaragüense or an undocumented Mexicano or Argentino, you're going to be mandated to do employment training and never, ever get a freaking job. I was going to use that word, but I know I'm in a pound. So I think it's very important for us. Harm reduction is the specific public health set strategies like naloxone distribution, plus, unless we're not doing and working in all these other intersections, not only we want to end the war on drugs, our folks are continued to die and being decimated by neglect and abandonment of both the public health system and government. So I hope that's, again, a way to tie what we are, the three of us are kind of highlighting in this conversation.
Laura, I think that's such a great point about the plus, right? Because when I think about harm reduction, I think about meeting people where there are, you know, where they are, making sure that we destigmatize people who use drugs and drug use itself, that we give people the education, the resources that they need to use drugs, right? So it's like drug checking tools, it could be safe consumption sites, naloxone, all of those things are really important, but it's the plus. You know, I think we definitely need to remember that, because we also have to talk about mental health. We also have to talk about housing and making sure that generally people's needs are met. Because when people's needs are met, I think this is when we can really start to talk about dismantling these oppressive systems. We can go beyond reform, right? We can talk about, you know, abolition and just building something completely new. So I did want to turn to Jeanette to give you an opportunity to talk about some legislation that you all are working on, either legislation or policy in California or nationally, that does approach drug use through a public health lens, to give people an idea of what's out there.
So in California, we're working on a bill to create an overdose prevention program, and it's essentially a place, more of a clinical setting, where someone who is a substance user could come in and use their pre-obtained drugs under medical supervision. And the whole purpose of these centers are to reduce overdoses or prevent overdoses. And they're basically done all over the world. I think the US is far behind and we're lagging. And this is the third time that we're running the bill, so third time's a charm, and we're hoping that we get it signed soon. But the whole premise of this is to destigmatize drug use, have folks go into a healthcare setting where they don't feel the stigma and be able to access services. So it's not just only overdose prevention, which is like a huge thing, right? But it's to also do these wraparound services. So folks want access to mental health, need help connecting with access to food, job training, access to healthcare services, and other mental health services. All of those services can be provided in a clinical setting, in a setting where folks who are drug users don't feel the stigma and can start building a relationship with the folks that run the center. And so that's one of our bills. The other bill that we're running this year is around syringe exchanges. Laura hit the nail on the head, right? 30 years later, we're still talking about access to clean syringes. In California, we are running a bill to create what's called a Sequa Exemption. California has its own Environmental Quality Act that requires folks to do sort of like a mini environmental impact statement or report before opening and operating a business. And a lot of our syringe exchange programs throughout the state were being challenged because it wasn't complying with this component of Sequa. So we're running a bill to exempt it from Sequa, still allow local entities to file a nuisance claim, but we're still hearing the same things, right? It's all about syringes and about syringe litter. And we forget about, the whole purpose of syringes is to stop communicable diseases, ensure that people have access to clean needles, that folks can have access to drug testing, because the overdose crisis is just really hitting everyone. And just one other point, playing off of what Laura said earlier, the drug war to a big extent is makes our communities invisible. Our office just came out with a report looking at the overdose rate among Latinos. By all intents and purposes, California seems to be doing okay in the overdose crisis, but when you drill down the numbers for Latinos, our community is not doing great. There are 5 counties where Latino overdose rates actually mirror what's happening on the East Coast, and that's and now we're being hit with fentanyl, and the fentanyl West Coast as well. But one of those counties is San Francisco, where I'm from, and Laura works, and we scratch our heads around this issue, right? Because we are invisibilized. We are not getting the services that we need. And so these policies and looking at, the impact that it has on different communities is critically important to address not only the need for services, but also the impact that the war on drugs has had on our community. And I know there's more stuff happening at the federal level, but I'll let Maritza, if you want to weigh in, because Maritza's all things federal for DPA.
Yeah, so I think the most exciting thing that we're doing at the federal level around harm reduction is just trying to get some solid federal funding for syringe service providers. We were talking about, have people having a safe supply of, tools for drug use. But that's something that the federal, well, first, let's talk about the fact that the federal government has banned, using funding specifically for syringes. So we're trying to lift that ban. But in addition, trying to create a steady stream of funding. We're talking millions of dollars here for harm reduction providers, syringe service providers, something that really hasn't been done before. In fact, we recently had $30 million appropriated for this purpose, but that's really the first time we've seen a number that big specifically for harm reduction. So I think that means we have a lot of work to do, but it also means that the messaging around harm reduction and the work that we're doing is finally starting to break into Congress, which is always difficult. So these conversations are important for that purpose. Eunice, I did want to turn to you specifically to talk about the Latinx community. If you could just, answer whether, drug policy is a Latinx issue, and then if you're, in your experience, if you've had any, I guess, like conflict from the community, or have you found that there's been a reluctance to embrace a public health approach to drug policy and drug use in your experience?
Thank you for that question. Definitely. I mean, yes, it's a Latinx issue, but I think that we have to tie it in from different like facets. So, like, it's a Latino issue. It's a Latinx issue because people who have mental health needs sometimes use substances, and it becomes a co-occurring issue because they self-medicate. The lack of affordable housing, the impending wave of evictions, just all of these things that are laid on our communities that tie in drug policy, because it's often these things, the trauma, the violence, that harm, by state sanctioned violence, that often leads people to use substances. And when we talk, and Laura had mentioned it, like, a lot of people use drugs, but it's, it's a small group of people who need the most support. And that's where we really have to focus on. Like, these are the folks who have a lot of these issues layered upon them, these different social determinants of health, right? Like if they're low, if they can't have jobs, if they can't have housing. So I just want to tie it in from that end, because oftentimes we talk about it, and the response that I've gotten, I've been doing this for a long time. My mom's all like, I've been told not to give the examples like these, but this is our community, and this is the literal responses that we're getting from our folks, Latinx folks in our community. But they're describing, like, why are we doing this work for marihuanos? Like, why are we trying to save people who use drugs? Like, they're using drugs, it's their decision. Like, that's the stigma that has that a lot of our communities have seen. And it's back to this lift yourself up from the bootstraps kind of idea, right? Like, you are responsible for your actions, without taking a step back and assessing, like, well, why is this person having problematic substance issues? Like, this person is houseless. Why? Like, it's taken me a long time to be able to have discussions like that with my loved ones, where they don't ask questions in a way that's stigmatizing, or they don't look at someone who might be houseless using substance in the street in a negative way, but instead of questions like, why are we not as a society offering someone like that person a place where they could go use, where there's nurses around? Why are we having, why did that person die of an overdose in the Starbucks bathroom in our neighborhood? Like, those questions coming from my loved ones have taken a lot of investment and labor from myself for them to see it, and for them to see it from that lens. Because, like I mentioned, oftentimes our community see it from a blaming perspective, and that's the work that we have to do, really, around showing our folks that this happens because we have failed in other parts of the society to uplift people. And this is why we need to be talking about moving resources, investing in safe consumption sites. When they talk about the issues around houselessness, like here in LA, they talk about, houseless encampments, literally talking about the pounds of poop and pee that they pick up and the thousands of needles. Well, why don't you open up a safe consumption site? That wouldn't happen if folks had a place to go. If instead of investing $50,000 on putting someone in jail for a drug offense, instead we could have housed them for a year with over $50,000. And so that's the kind of labor that I feel like we have to do to let our folks know, you have to be looking at these issues from different lenses, because it is a health issue. It's a housing issue. It's a mental health issue. But I would love to hear what other folks have to add to this. That's just been my experience, what I've seen, what the work that needs to be done. And it's a lot about these one-on-one convos with our folks. And yeah, I'll pass it back to you, Maritza.
Yeah, thank you.
I would just like to add, that it's definitely a Latino issue. We know that over 250,000 folks have been deported in the last couple of years for simple drug possession. As I mentioned, I'm an immigration attorney, and under immigration law, you can be deported for having 30 grams or less of marijuana. You're either found deportable or inadmissible. It could even be an old drug charge, and you could have a green card and be coming back into the country, and they won't let you into the U.S. if that old drug charge shows up on your record. And so, when we talk about family separation, this is the root of family separation right here, and it's also so important to note that this is cross-movement work, right? These are different systems of oppression that continue to hurt our communities, to over-stigmatize our community, over-criminalize, and tear our families apart. And so we have to understand how these systems all work together. The other quick thing I will say, I think I saw it in the chat, is, Latinos have to understand that this is a Latino issue. I mean, we see the war on drugs playing out in Latin America. It has torn and devastated countries, far and wide. People have left Latin America because of the drug war. there is some movement, right, in places like Uruguay and Mexico that are looking at to decriminalize, and that's really where we need to go. And DPA has been doing a lot of work around really looking to decriminalize drugs, because that is the root of all of these systems of oppression. And so, really excited about this conversation.
Yeah, that was really good. And actually, you answered an audience question. An audience member did ask about the drug war in Latin America. I should have started by saying that I was going to be talking about the drug war in the domestic policy context. But of course, everything that's happened in Latin America is super relevant. What we've seen in Latin America is a US-funded, war on drugs that's caused migration. And then the irony of all of that is, if, after people have gone through so many traumatic things and might, be in the US and using drugs to cope with some of those traumatic things, we then punish, detain, and deport them back to those countries, and we created the problems that they're running away from. So it's like the cyclical, sustained violence. So I'm going to drop in the chat just a report that the Drug Policy Alliance did on the war on drugs. And there's a specific report on there on immigration. But I did also want to turn to Laura to have you chime in and please give us your opinion on the question from what Onisis and Jeanette said. And then also, if you could please talk about why it's important to include directly impacted people in this work.
Yeah, I wanted to say that it's beautiful how we're kind of building the threads, because in some ways, why it's so important to Latinos is because we're colonial subjects in the United States and colonial subjects in our countries. And actually, if you watch any Latino narco novela, it's all that is happening in our countries. Our countries are being run as a by drug trade that is related to the United States and any other colonial powers as the only means of economic gain and support. So I just want to add that. And specifically in San Francisco, we have been dealing actually with Latino elected officials who are pushing a narrative. And so I want to also say that, because I know we have some judges in the room and some folks here, we have our city attorney actually pushing civil injunctions for the very folks who have been migrating from Honduras and Central America, those wars, and for being, both trafficked and then selling small amounts of narcotics, and in particular now the big ugly drug, which is fentanyl, and they are trying to block them from existing in some of our neighborhoods. And so we're fighting really, really hard in San Francisco, and DPA has joined us in this fight along with many immigrant rights groups, is to say this will solve nothing. They were arguing that we will reduce overdoses if we do civil injunctions and criminalize our small dope, dealers. And we know it's untrue. We know that it doesn't change conditions and it doesn't end overdoses. So it's also the time as Latinos to also challenge, decide who are we voting, and actually really organize, because this issue is deeply impacting of all of us. And in closing, I want to just say that for the Harm Reduction movement, and I know for a lot of our community organizing, the voices of those most impacted should be at the table. And so in terms of talking about this subject, we will need to do a lot of political education in our community, but also conversations. How is harm reduction happening in the ground? Folks are doing a lot of stuff to stay alive, and we need to learn from them. We also need to learn from our community, Latinx community, people who use drugs. What can we do that really makes a difference? We're thinking about safe injunction sites, safe consumption sites. What would they look for Latinos that they feel comfortable and not afraid of deportation? Will it be this massive, massive structures where everybody can see you, or should we do it at a very small basis in small community-based organizations? I had the privilege to be in Vancouver and see how in Vancouver now they have very many ways in which they're doing it. So we need to hear, the folks got to be on the table. We have to also start to inspire policy by what our folks say, not what we think we should do. And I just think that in my experience, it's only people who are impacted who's going to really take us to the next level on this ending the war on drugs.
Thank you for that. So we're a minute over time. So unfortunately, we have to wrap up this wonderful conversation. I could continue to talk about this. You all provided such great information, and I hope our audience felt similarly. I was monitoring the questions as we were having this conversation, and I think hopefully we addressed all of the audience questions just through the natural flow of this conversation. I just did want to plug one last thing before we head out. So at the federal level, we're working on a big bill called the MORE Act, the Marijuana Opportunity Reinvestment and Expungement Act. Last year, we made history when this bill passed the House. It became the first time Congress voted to deschedule marijuana. Now, I will say at the Drug Policy Alliance, we support the decriminalization of all drugs, but Congress is, again, very much behind where the public is. So decriminalizing marijuana would make a huge impact, not just because it would, remove marijuana from the list of controlled substances. We would start by decriminalizing, but also this is a reparative justice bill. It would resentence and expungement marijuana convictions and reinvest marijuana tax dollars back into the community to provide things like, making sure that people have housing, jobs, benefits, all of that. Some of the very important things that we talked about today. If you're interested in supporting that bill, visit the Drug Policy Alliance, sign up to receive our newsletter, and you will have access to action alerts. We do have to hop off, but I will give it, maybe a quick lightning round if our panelists just want to say something before we close.
Yes, I'll go first. I'll be fast. I'll say that, in our efforts to end the war on drugs, decriminalize drugs, and support our communities, we can do it in a way where we are not giving more money and more power to the systems that we're trying to dismantle, from the cops all the way to the judges. We don't have to give those departments and agencies more responsibilities, and we should not leave anybody behind. And so I say that because, we are talking about drug policy reform, but we should be at least our focus in LA County on the ground has been abolition. And how do we advance harm reduction without giving more money to cops or making them social workers? How do we get people out of the jails? How do we change policy so it's not dichotomizing of this drug user yes, but this drug user no? And so that's one thing I appreciate about the DPA having those conversations. But I hope that moving forward, we know that we can end the war on drugs without expanding the traditional system of incarceration and harm that we have traditionally seen impact our communities. So I think the response around community responses, Laura, that's what we're trying to heavily do here, because we know even some of our communities won't even call the cops because they're scared of immigration and other things. So the more we invest in community and less in those systems, the better off we're going to be. Thank you, team.
The only thing I would add is, go ahead. The only thing I would add is, as we look to end the war on drugs and decriminalize all drugs, marijuana, all of it, that we make these things accessible to our communities, right? To really vulnerable, really marginalized folks. And what does that mean? That means really looking at the healthcare system, really looking at the mental health care system, and looking at the substance treatment system. And how do we make meaningful reform for those who need it the most?
Yeah, my last one, I think, has been said, but to really think about this issue again as a way to actually build solidarity and organize along Black and Native American folks. The numbers clearly indicate that overdose deaths mostly impact in proportion Black and Native American folks, in numbers increasingly Latinx. So I think it is a moment where as we do work, we have to do work with our own community. We also have to continuously look what are those spaces where we can actually organize and fight together. Thank you.
All right, well, thank you all for this wonderful conversation. Thank you for our audience for joining, our esteemed panelists for this great conversation. Please log back into discussions and find the next panel that are starting now. So you're more than welcome to leave. Thanks for join the next session, and I hope to see you later at this meeting. Thanks.
Start trickling
Thank you,
in.
gracias.
Thank you.
Okay.
Just give it a minute or so as the last panel's ending, if that sounds good to everyone.
Oh yeah, definitely.
And then we'll jump right in. Ajane, were you speaking on an earlier panel this morning?
In an allies breakout group.
Awesome.
And we ended up teaming up, so that was fun.
Nice.
Yeah. Always fun to talk about coalitions.
Yes, critical.
Okay, we made it.
There she is.
All right. I guess we can start. We have 7 people here, so let's get going. Well, everybody, welcome to the Private Prison and Profit Motive session. My name is Angie Young, and I'm with the Heising Simons Foundation, and I'm joined by 3 amazing leaders, Silky Shaw,